Smoke came over the fence line, before anyone had time to shout. A silver-haired woman hauled her horse around, and rode straight into the wall of fire. Nobody stopped her. Nobody was fast enough. The wind shifted. Spring grass, dried past the point of burning, doesn't creep. It runs 100 yards a minute. Somewhere back inside that smoke, a boy was coughing, one boot tangled in a length of rusted chain. 61 years old. Both hands locked hard on the saddle. Her body nearly parallel to the ground. This fire didn't come down out of the sky. Didn't come from a cigarette rolled careless too close to dry tinder. Somebody lit it. The nearest fence post caught, wood popping, sparks riding the wind straight into the horse's mane. The last gap in the line was closing, for seconds, maybe less. She got low over the saddle, dug in her heels, and drove clean through it. The wind came down off the ridge, that morning carrying dust, and nothing else. No rain in it. No promise of rain either. Just dust, fine as flour, settling into the collar of Wyatt Calder's good coat, while he stood on the platform at Coldwater Junction, with a fistful of wild bluebonnet going soft in his grip. He'd cut them before sunup. Out past the north fence line, where the frost still clung stubborn to the low ground. Kneeling there in his one good pair of trousers, because a man doesn't stand up in front of a bride, even a bride he'd never once laid eyes on, without something in his hand to give her. 29 years old. 29 days from 30. He didn't need to check the letter in his breast pocket to know the exact wording of his father's will. He'd read it enough times. Could recite it in his sleep now. Had, more than once, if Otis was telling it straight. A married man. Keeping a household. By his 30th birthday. 6 words that could take a man's whole inheritance, and split it clean in half like a fence rail under an axe. He said her name the whole ride into town. Louisa Bennett. Said it low. Said it over, and over until it stopped sounding like somebody else's name, and started sounding like something that belonged to him. Except it never quite got there. Because there's a difference between a name a man's repeated 100 times, and a name he's actually earned the right to say out loud. In front of witnesses. In front of God, and a circuit preacher, and whatever family he had left standing. Wyatt didn't know that difference yet. He was about to. The train came in loud. Groaning on the rails. Hissing steam across the platform boards in one long exhale, like something that had been holding its breath the whole ride, and only now let it go. And Wyatt watched every window, as it rolled past. Every single one. The way a man watches a darkening sky, when he already knows weather's coming, and just doesn't know, yet which direction it's fixing to hit him from. A woman stepped down from the second car. Wrong shoes. That was the first thing. Not her face, not her age, not anything about who she was, just the shoes. Riding boots, worn soft through the leather, heels ground down uneven the way boots get, when somebody spent years standing in a stirrup instead of a parlor. Then the coat. Man's coat. Sleeves rolled twice at the cuff. Then the gun belt. Sitting low on the hip. Worn smooth the way only real use wears leather smooth. Then, finally, because Wyatt's eyes had worked their way up slow, stalling against a truth he already half suspected, her face. Lined. Weathered. A face that had spent decades under open sky, and had the creases to prove it. Silver hair pulled back tight under a wide-brimmed hat. Not 22. Not even close to 22. Wyatt's stomach did something complicated. Dropped and turned at the same time. Because this woman, whoever she was carrying a coiled length of rope slung crosswise, over one shoulder. The kind cattlemen used. Not a hatbox. Not a trunk full of Boston dresses. A rope. And Wyatt stood there, with his flowers going limp in his fist, and thought, that is not a bride. That is somebody who's about to ruin my whole morning. He stepped forward anyway. Because hope does most of a man's thinking for him in moments like that one. Same as it always has. Same as it always will. Miss Bennet. The woman stopped him cold. One hand up. Flat palm. Fingers spread wide. The exact gesture a person throws at a spooked calf about to bolt through an open gate the wrong way. Quick. Sure. No wasted motion. Wyatt stopped. She looked at him a long moment. Studying him the way a person studies a horse, before buying it. Checking for something. Something she half expected to find. And was disappointed, somehow, when she did. Wrong woman, she said. And wrong bride, far as that goes. Just that. No apology in it. No softening. Nothing to help a man fold his flowers back down, into his own fist gracefully. Louisa sent me instead. Louisa. Not Miss Bennet. Not the bride. Just, Louisa. Like the two of them were old acquaintances, and Wyatt was the outsider in his own courtship. Here is the part nobody standing on that platform expected. Not the station agent, wiping his hands on his apron in the depot doorway. Not old Pruitt, from the mercantile, leaning against the mail cart, pretending very hard not to watch the whole thing unfold. Not even Wyatt himself. Because if you'd asked him 30 seconds earlier what he'd do the moment his intended bride turned out to be a total stranger standing on a platform in somebody else's boots, he couldn't have told you. Didn't know. Hadn't rehearsed for this. A man doesn't rehearse for the moment his whole plan falls apart in front of a train full of witnesses. He smiled. Lowered the flowers. Held his hand out instead. Like he was greeting a new ranch hand, and not a stranger who'd just derailed 6 months of careful hope. Then I'm obliged to you, he said. Whoever you are. For riding a long way to bring a stranger bad news face to face. Most folks would have mailed it. Let the distance do the hard part for them. Something crossed the woman's expression. Not suspicion, exactly. Not respect either. It landed somewhere between the two, and decided to stay a while. She shook his hand. Firm grip. Nothing soft in it. Cora Whitfield, she said. Wyatt Calder, I take it. Heard your name twice already on the ride in. Once from the porter. Once from a woman crying, into a handkerchief 2 cars up. That bad a reputation already? Depends entirely on who's doing the telling. 3 days earlier. Cora Whitfield had been minding her own business entirely. Which was cattle. Which was fence line, and feed money, and a mortgage note, that had, without any warning at all, gotten a great deal heavier than it had been the week before. 61 years old. Widowed 8 of them. She could read a lane gate hinge, from 50 paces. Could rope a spooked steer in the dark by the sound of its breathing alone. Could sleep 4 hours on frozen ground, and wake up sharper than most men managed, after a full night in a feather bed. Because she'd had to learn all of it fast. The year Thomas died, Hart just stopped one morning out past the south pasture, no warning, no goodbye, nothing but a horse, that came back to the barn alone. The whole county had assumed the widow Whitfield would sell up inside the year. Move somewhere sensible. Somewhere a woman her age belonged, whatever that meant to people who'd never once had to find out for themselves. She hadn't. She'd buried her husband on a Tuesday, and been back in the saddle by Thursday. Because grief doesn't feed cattle. Doesn't mend fence. Doesn't do a single useful thing except sit in a person's chest like a stone, and a working ranch has no patience for stones. Larkspur wasn't big. Never had been. 200 head, some good grass, a house Thomas built, with his own hands the year they married. But it was hers. Free and clear. Or it had been, right up until 3 weeks ago, when a letter arrived, from a bank in Cheyenne she'd never once done business with. The note on your late husband's original land purchase has been acquired by a new holder. Payment in full is now due, within 60 days, or the property will be forfeit under the terms of the original agreement. Cora had read that letter 4 times standing at her own kitchen table, before the words finally arranged themselves into something she could believe. Because Thomas's note had been settled. She was nearly certain of it. Had the receipt somewhere, old, yellowed, tucked into a strongbox she hadn't opened in years, because there'd been no reason to. A debt paid off is a debt a person stops thinking about. Except now somebody was saying it wasn't paid off at all. That there was still a balance. A balance nobody had ever mentioned to her in 8 years of quiet, uneventful ownership. She'd ridden into Cheyenne to ask about it in person. Gotten nothing but a clerk's polite shrug, and a name she didn't recognize, some holding concern, some set of initials on a letterhead, nothing that told her a single useful thing about who actually wanted her land and why. So when Louisa Bennett, pale, and shaking, 2 seats up on the train out of Omaha, clutching a letter she couldn't bring herself to deliver, had grabbed Cora's sleeve in a full panic, and begged for help, Cora's first instinct had been to say no. She had cattle in the stock car behind her. A buyer waiting in Coldwater Junction. A mortgage clock running down whether she liked it or not. She had exactly 0 reason to say yes. She said yes anyway. Couldn't have told you why. Not then. Not later, either, if you'd pressed her, over supper about it. Except that somebody had needed to, and the somebody standing closest happened, this once, to be her. She figured she'd hand the rancher his letter. Say her piece plain. Be back on the train inside 10 minutes. That is not, in the end, how the 10 minutes went. There's a letter, Cora said. Once the handshake had come back down, and neither one of them had quite let go of the moment sitting between them. She held it out. She asked me to give you this instead of saying it herself. I read enough on the ride, over to spare you the flowery parts. If you'd rather hear it plain, then. She's not coming. Wyatt looked down at the unopened envelope. Didn't move to take it yet. She got as far as Nebraska, Cora said, and worked out that Wyoming's a great deal more Wyoming than she'd pictured sitting in a Boston parlor. She's sorry. I believe she means it. She's not a bad woman, Mr. Calder. Just the wrong woman for this particular piece of ground. Figured that out about 400 miles too late to say it kindly to your face. A pause. So she's saying it kindly through me instead. Wyatt stared down at the envelope a long moment. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite grief. And wasn't quite relief. Which meant it landed somewhere honest between the two, the way the truest things usually do. I'm obliged to you, he said finally. Wasn't much of a bargain, though. Riding out on your own cattle to hand a stranger his heartbreak. Same week you've got a mortgage clock of your own running, sounds like. Cora went still. Because she hadn't said a word about the mortgage. Not to him. Not to anybody in this town. How would you know that? Not a question. A flat, careful statement with an edge folded into it. Wyatt held up both hands. Not a threat. Just steady. You didn't say it. Your face did. Same look I've been wearing 3 weeks straight, near as I can tell. A person doesn't get a look like that from cattle prices. Cora studied him another long moment. Then, slow, like she was setting a weight down she'd been carrying too long to notice how heavy it had gotten, somebody's calling a note on my land. Note I believed was settled 8 years back. No name on the letter worth anything. Just initials and a Cheyenne address, that leads nowhere. Wyatt's jaw tightened. What initials? G. C. Holdings. The platform went very quiet. Because Wyatt Calder didn't need a single further word explained to him. Didn't need the rest of the alphabet spelled out. Grady Calder. His own cousin's initials, dressed up in a holding company's letterhead like a wolf in a borrowed coat. Say that again, Wyatt said. Voice gone low. G.C. Holdings, Cora repeated. Why? Does it mean something to you? It means, Wyatt said, that you and I might have ridden into the same fire, from two different directions, Mrs. Whitfield. And neither one of us knew it till just now. The Coldwater Hotel dining room smelled like burnt coffee and wet wool. They sat across from each other at a corner table, cups going cold between them, and Wyatt laid the whole ugly shape of it out plain. Because there wasn't any sense hiding it now. Not from a woman whose own trouble had just turned out to share a bloodline with his. His father, Elias Calder, had built the Red Wing out of 11,000 acres of good grass and 30 years of stubbornness. Had died the autumn before, left behind a will that every lawyer who'd ever read it agreed on exactly one point about. It was the document of a proud man determined to keep steering his son's whole life from 6 feet under the ground. The Red Wing would pass whole to Wyatt, clean and complete, provided he was a married man keeping a household by his 30th birthday. Failing that, the ranch split in half. One side to Wyatt. The other to his cousin Grady, a man who'd never once in his life pulled a calf out of a hard berth, or mended so much as a single strand of fence wire, but who had, for the last 6 months, been in quiet and entirely unbrotherly negotiation with a land agent representing the railroad. My father figured a wife would settle me, Wyatt said. Truth is, I think mostly he was scared of exactly what's happening now. Grady wants his half sold the very day that clock runs out. Railroad money. Whoever pays quickest and asks fewest questions. Once outside money owns half of this ranch. He stopped. Rubbed at his jaw like the words tasted bad going down. The whole of it goes. Mine included. Inside 2 years. I've watched it happen already to 3 good outfits in this county. Better run than half the ranches still standing today. I don't aim to watch it happen to a 4th. So you advertised for a wife, Cora said. Like ordering seed corn out of a catalog. Not proud of the method. Didn't ask if you were proud of it. Ping. Pong. No wasted motion in either of them. Wyatt almost smiled, despite everything sitting on the table between them. I'm 29 days from losing the only thing my father ever built, he said. Pride's a luxury item I'm running short on this particular spring. Cora sat with her coffee going cold in her hands. Turned the whole shape of it over slow in her mind, the way she'd turn a horse over before buying. Checking legs. Checking teeth. Checking temperament. All 3 at once, because a person doesn't get a second look before the money's already changed hands. And you think Grady Calder's behind my note too? I don't think it, Wyatt said. I know the man. Grady doesn't do a single thing by accident. If your husband's note came back to life 8 years after it should have been dead and buried, that's not an accident, Mrs. Whitfield. That's a strategy. Larkspur borders my north range, doesn't it? Cora went very still. How would you? Every rancher within 40 miles knows whose land sits where. Larkspur runs right up against my north fence line. Which means if Grady's holding paper on both of us at the same time. He's not after 2 ranches, Cora said, finishing it, her voice gone flat, and cold with the sudden clean shape of the whole thing arriving all at once. He's after 1 corridor. Straight through both of them. Straight through to the rail line. Silence sat between them a long moment. Outside, a wagon rattled past on the street, wheels loud on the hard-packed dirt. I've got 60 days, Cora said finally. I've got 29. Then one of us is going to lose faster than the other. Unless, Wyatt said, and here his voice changed. Went careful. The way a man's voice goes, when he's approaching something he's not entirely sure he's got the right to ask for. Unless we're not fighting it, as two separate fires. Unless we're fighting it as one. Cora looked at him a long, long moment. You're asking a stranger you met 40 minutes ago to marry you. I'm asking a stranger I met 40 minutes ago, Wyatt said, to help me keep a ranch. And maybe help me figure out how to keep hers, too, in the bargain. How that gets arranged on paper, that's a conversation for later. And only if you're willing to have it at all. He looked at her steady. Didn't blink. Didn't reach for the flowers wilting on the table between them like evidence in a case already closed. I was engaged to a woman I never once met, for 6 months, he said. Came to exactly nothing. I'm not fool enough to think a wedding fixes anything that isn't already true underneath it. But I've got 29 days, and a cousin who's a decent liar doing an indecent job of ruining 2 families at once. And I'd rather spend those days working beside somebody honest than sitting around waiting on somebody who's already told me, through a stranger, and a folded letter, that she doesn't want this life. Cora didn't answer right away. Because there was a version of this moment, where she stood up. Walked straight back to the depot. Caught the next train out, and let this man's collapsing engagement be somebody else's problem entirely. There was another version, and this was the one that actually happened, though she couldn't have told you in that moment exactly why she chose it, where she sat there a while longer. Turning it over. Thinking about a letter, with 2 initials on it, that had no business existing 8 years, after her husband's debt was supposedly closed. Thinking about Holt. Her son. 26 now, gone east to Boston 3 years back to read law, and about as far removed, from cattle and fence wire, as a person could get, while still technically sharing her blood. He'd written her not 2 weeks prior. A long letter, careful and loving in the particular exhausting way of a son, who believes he knows better than his own mother what's good for her. Mother, you cannot keep running that place alone forever. You're 61 years old. If something happened to you out there, who would even know for days? I've found a very respectable boarding situation here in the city. Please, just consider it. She had written back exactly 4 words. I am considering nothing. Holt meant well. She believed that, mostly, on her better days. But there was something in the tone of his letters, the way consider it always seemed to mean give it up, that had been sitting cold and unresolved in her chest for longer than the mortgage trouble had. A woman doesn't stop being capable the day her hair goes silver. Nobody had ever managed to explain to Cora Whitfield why the rest of the world seemed so determined to forget that particular fact. 2 days, she said finally. I've got a buyer waiting on my cattle. Can give you 2 days, while I settle that business proper. After that, Wyatt said, we'll have worked out whether 2 days was the start of something, or the whole entire end of it. It was, Cora thought later, possibly the strangest arrangement ever struck, over lukewarm hotel coffee in the whole history of the territory. It was also, and this part landed harder, landed somewhere she wasn't ready, yet to look at directly, one of the more honest conversations she'd had, with anybody in longer than she cared to count. The 2 days stretched, without much ceremony on either side, into something longer, before either of them had quite noticed it happening. The ride out to Red Wing took the better part of an afternoon. Cora sat her horse easy the whole way, watching the land change under her, good grass, better than her own in places, running clean to a horizon unbroken by a single lean fence post. The house stood sound when they finally came up on it. Squared timber. Tight joints. A porch that didn't groan in any of the wrong places. And the hands. 4 of them came out to meet the wagon, watching Cora ride in, with the wary courtesy of men waiting to find out whether the newcomer could actually work, before they made up their minds whether to like her. Otis Meade was the oldest by 20 years of earning the title, not by anybody handing it to him. Gray through the temples. Quiet in the way men get quiet, after they've buried more friends than most folks meet in a lifetime. He didn't say much to Cora, that first evening. Just watched. The way a man watches weather building on the horizon, trying to work out which direction it's fixing to break. There was a younger hand too, name of Dale, who talked more, and laughed easy, the kind of man who'd follow Otis straight into a burning barn, without stopping to ask why, because Otis had never once led him wrong in all his years riding for the Calders. And then there was Jonah Pratt. Couldn't have been more than 20. Nervous hands, always moving. A laugh that landed half a second late, like he was checking first whether laughing was even allowed. Cora noticed. Filed it away without dwelling on it. Everybody's got their reasons for being jumpy, and a working ranch is no place to go digging into another man's private business on the very first evening. "Ma'am," Otis said, touching his hat. "Careful. Formal. The particular formal a man uses when he's reserving judgment." "Mr. Meade. Heard you're staying on a spell." "Heard right. Doing what, exactly, if you don't mind my asking?" Cora looked at him a long moment. Then swung down off her horse, smooth, no wasted motion, the dismount of somebody who'd done it 10,000 times, and would do it 10,000 more, before she was through, and said, "Whatever needs doing." "Same as anybody." Otis didn't answer that. But something in his face shifted. Small. Almost nothing. A man revising a first impression, and not quite ready, yet to say so out loud. She settled the question of whether she could actually work before sundown that same day. A heifer had gotten herself stuck fast in the mud past the west fence line, not far from a low, boggy stretch the hands called Widow's Draw, on account of an animal it had claimed 2 seasons back. Panicked. Sunk near to the chest. Going under fast, the way mud swallows a full-grown animal whole, if nobody moves quick enough. Otis was already building a loop, when Cora rode past him at a dead run. She had the rope out, before her horse had fully stopped moving. First throw missed. Mud sucking hard at the heifer's legs. The animal thrashing. Time bleeding away the way it does in moments like that, all at once, not gradually. Second throw caught clean around the neck. Cora wheeled her horse. Dug her heels in. Hauled that heifer clear of a bog that had already claimed one animal on this ranch the season before. Then she set the leg herself, right there in the mud. No hesitation. Better, by Dale's account at supper, that night, than the county vet could have managed riding out, from 20 miles off. By the time she walked back, into the yard, mud-caked chest to boot, smelling like the underside of the whole earth, the hands had stopped calling her ma'am, with the careful edges on it. Started calling her ma'am the way a person says it to somebody who's actually earned the word. Wyatt watched all of it from the porch. Something crossed his face, that Cora caught twice, that evening and couldn't quite name. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to recognition. The way a man looks at a tune he can't quite place, but knows underneath the not knowing, that he's heard it before. Because here is the thing nobody tells you about being 61 years old in a country built for young men's hands, Cora thought, riding back toward the barn in the last of the light. Nobody warns you that the world stops seeing you the day your hair goes silver. Stops asking what you can do, and starts assuming, quiet and polite, and infuriating, that the answer must be less than it used to be. They were wrong about that. They'd always been wrong about that. She just hadn't had many chances lately to prove it to anybody who was actually watching. That night, over a supper of beans and hard bread at the long table, Otis finally said the thing he'd clearly been turning over since the bog. "Where'd you learn to throw a rope like that?" "My husband taught me," Cora said. 40 years back. Said if I was going to live on cattle land, I wasn't going to be the kind of wife who stood at the fence and watched. Said a plain wife was fine for some men. wasn't fine for him. He's still around? No. Just that. No further explaining offered, none asked for. Otis nodded slow, the nod of a man who understood exactly how much weight was sitting behind that one small word, and had the good sense not to go digging at it. 8 years, then, he said. Running that place alone. 8 years, Cora said. And it's still standing. Same as I am. Jonah, down at the far end of the table, had gone very quiet during all of this. Picking at his food. Not eating much of it. Cora noticed, filed it away again, same as before, but said nothing. Because a person learns, at 61, which battles are hers to fight, and which ones aren't. Yet. Which is a lesson, she thought, that takes considerably longer to learn than most folks ever give a body credit for. The letter from Holt arrived 2 days later, forwarded on from Larkspur by a neighbor, who knew where she'd gone. Cora read it standing in the yard, the paper trembling slightly in a wind that had nothing to do with why her hands weren't quite steady. Mother, I have written to a Mr. Prescott at the land office regarding your situation. He believes there may be grounds to contest the note, but he also believes, and I agree with him entirely, that the wisest course, given your age, and the isolation of the property, is simply to let the note stand and relocate. I know you will not want to hear this. I am asking you to hear it anyway. I cannot keep worrying myself sick over you out there alone. Cora folded the letter twice. Slow. Careful. The way a person folds something they're not ready to burn, but don't especially want to look at again either. Alone, she thought. He keeps saying alone like it's a diagnosis. Like it's a thing gone wrong in me instead of a thing I chose. Which, and here was the part that stung, if she was honest, with herself standing there in the yard, which maybe he half believes. Because sons do that. Decide, quiet and loving and completely wrong-headed, what their mothers are still capable of. Long before the mother herself has any say in the matter at all. She put the letter away in her coat pocket. Didn't answer it that night. Told herself there'd be time later, once the note trouble settled enough, that she could sit and write her son a letter that said what she actually meant instead of something calmer and smaller that wouldn't scare him further. She should have written back sooner. She'd understand that later. Understand it a great deal too late to matter the way she wanted it to. Right now there was a cousin named Grady Calder circling 2 ranches like a buzzard, that hadn't quite worked out, yet whether both carcasses were dead. He rode in on the 9th morning. Cora heard the hooves, before she saw the rider, 3 horses, coming up the drive at an easy pace, that somehow managed to feel entirely unhurried, and entirely threatening at the same time. She was out by the corral, checking a gate hinge, and she straightened slow, one hand resting easy near her hip out of nothing but old habit. Wyatt came out, onto the porch, before the riders had even fully reined up in the yard. Grady Calder sat his horse like a man who'd already decided the ground beneath him wasn't worth the trouble of dismounting onto. Younger than Wyatt by a couple years, dressed too fine for ranch country, a smile on his face that never once made it up into his eyes. 2 men rode with him. Hired men. The kind who didn't work cattle for a living, Cora could tell, that much from 30 yards off, same as she could tell a lame horse from a lazy one. The way they sat their saddles. The way their hands stayed close by their belts instead of resting easy on the reins. Cousin, Grady called out, not bothering to raise his voice much. Word in town is your bride never showed. Word in town travels fast, Wyatt said. Faster than most of it deserves to. Grady's eyes slid over to Cora. Slow. Deliberate. The look of a man sizing up an animal he intended to disqualify from a race on a technicality, before the gates had even opened. And this, he said, would be Cora Whitfield, Cora said, before Wyatt could get a single word in. Voice level. The level that had settled 40 head of nervous cattle, onto a rail car, without once needing to be raised. Larkspur Ranch. Might have heard of it. Seeing as your holding company appears to have taken a sudden and considerable interest in it. Something flickered across Grady's face. Small. Fast. Gone almost before it arrived. But Cora saw it. And Wyatt saw her see it. I'm not familiar with any holding company, Grady said. Smooth. Practiced. Funny, Cora said. Because it's got your initials on the letterhead. The yard went very quiet. Even the horses seemed to feel it. One of Grady's hired men shifted his weight in the saddle, remembering, all of a sudden, that he was outnumbered on ground that belonged, by every legal measure, that mattered, to the people standing in front of him. Grady recovered fast. Credit where it was due, the man had a smile that could survive nearly anything. G.C. holding services a great many accounts across this territory, Mrs. Whitfield. I can't be expected to keep track of every widow's paperwork. Funny, Cora said again. Same flat, unbothered tone. Because it's a mighty small territory for a coincidence that particular. Grady's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough. He looked back to Wyatt. Dropped the smile a degree or two, like a man setting down a tool he no longer needed for this part of the job. 20 days left, cousin, he said. 20 days, and this ranch splits clean in half whether you like the arithmetic or not. I'd think carefully about who you're choosing to spend them with. A woman old enough to be your mother isn't going to satisfy a judge that this marriage is anything but a desperate man's last trick to dodge his own father's will. She's not here to marry me, Wyatt said. Voice gone quiet. Quiet in the particular way that costs a man nearly everything he's got to hold onto in a moment exactly like this one. She's here because your holding company appears to be running the exact same play against her that it's running against me. Which makes me wonder, cousin, just how many ranches in this county you've got your hand in right now. And how a judge is going to feel about that once somebody puts the whole pattern in front of him at once. For the first time, since he'd ridden into the yard, Grady Calder didn't have an answer ready. Just a moment. Half a second, maybe less. But Cora caught it, and so did Wyatt, and so, Cora would have bet good money on it, did the two hired men sitting their horses a little too straight back now for men who'd ridden out expecting an easy morning's intimidation. Then Grady's smile came back. Thinner this time. You'll want to be careful, he said. Both of you. Disputed land makes for dangerous ground. Accidents happen out here. Fires and the like. He turned his horse. Didn't wait for a reply. The three of them rode out the way they'd come, unhurried, and it wasn't until the dust had fully settled that Wyatt finally let his shoulders come down from somewhere near his ears. That was a threat, Cora said. Flat. Not a question. That was a threat, Wyatt agreed. Man like that only understands the one thing, Cora said, half to herself, watching the empty road a long moment. Somebody willing to stand just as still as he is. And mean it every bit as much. Wyatt looked over at her. You did that on purpose, he said. Baiting him. Letting him know we'd already put the two ranches together. I did. Why? Because a man like Grady Calder doesn't fear a fight, she said finally. He fears being seen. Fears somebody putting his whole pattern out in the open, where a judge, or a bank, or the whole rest of this county can look at it plain, and understand exactly what kind of man they're dealing with. So you make sure he knows, early, before he's finished building whatever he thinks he's building, that somebody's already watching. Wyatt studied her a long moment. Something in his face had shifted since the morning at the station. 20 days, he said quietly. 20 days, Cora agreed. And somewhere out past the north fence line, though neither one of them could have known it yet, a length of half-rotted rag waited in a shed, soaking slow in kerosene, and a young man, with debts he couldn't outrun, was about to be handed a match, and a reason he'd spend the rest of his life regretting. But that was still ahead of them. For now there was only the yard, gone quiet again, and the dust settling slow back down, onto ground that two people, 129, 161, both of them a great deal more alone than either had planned on being this particular spring, had just decided, without either one saying the words out loud yet, to defend together. Whatever it cost them. Whatever came riding up that drive next. 20 days left didn't feel like 20 days, so much as it felt like waiting. Which is its own particular kind of exhausting. Because waiting isn't rest. Waiting is a held breath a person doesn't realize they're holding, until their chest starts to ache from it. 20 days. Then 19. Then 18. Wyatt woke every morning counting it, before he'd even opened his eyes all the way. Each morning shaving one more day off a debt he still didn't fully understand how to repay, no matter how carefully he studied the will's language, or how many times he ran the arithmetic of it in his own head. Except debts like that don't wait around for a man to understand them. They just come due. Cora rode out to Larkspur on the third morning, after the confrontation. Alone. Didn't ask Wyatt to come with her, and he didn't offer, because there are some fires a person has to walk through by themselves the first time, even when there's somebody who'd gladly walk through it beside them. 17 days left. She found her own gate standing open. Not broken. Not forced. Just open. The kind of open that means somebody walked through it, looked around at everything she owned, and walked back out again, without bothering to close it behind them. A message dressed up as carelessness. She stood there a long moment. Hand resting on the top rail. Jaw set tight. Because this was the thing about a threat like Grady Calder's. It didn't need to burn anything down yet. It just needed to prove it could walk through her gate whenever it wanted. Prove it already knew the shape of her land better than she'd like. Prove that the fence she'd built, with her own two hands, the fence Thomas had strung wire on the summer, before he died, meant exactly nothing to a man, with enough money, and enough patience. She closed the gate herself. Latched it. Stood there another moment, with her hand still on the wood. 61 years old, she thought. And somebody still believes I won't notice an open gate. Believes silver hair means dull eyes. Believes a widow's ranch is just an empty house waiting for somebody bolder to walk in and claim it. They're wrong. They've always been wrong. I just have to prove it loud enough, that even a fool like Grady Calder finally hears it. She rode back to Red Wing, that evening instead of staying at Larkspur alone. Told herself it was practical. Told herself there wasn't any sense splitting her attention across two properties, when the real fight was happening on one calendar. Told herself a great many things, that evening that weren't, strictly speaking, the whole truth. Because the whole truth was simpler than any of that. And a good deal harder to say out loud. The whole truth was, that she didn't want to be alone in that house tonight. Not after an open gate. Not after a man who smiled without his eyes ever joining in. The grazing dispute started the way most disputes start out here. Quiet. Then all at once. A neighbor's cattle, Grady's cattle, though he'd never once put his own name on the brand, always some cousin, or partner or holding concern standing between him and anything a person could point to directly, started drifting onto the contested strip of grass running along Red Wing's north boundary. Not a stampede. Not dramatic. Just a slow, patient creep. 10 head 1 week. 30 the next. Until the grass, that had fed Wyatt's herd for 30 years started thinning out under hooves, that had no business being there. Otis found the first of it on a Tuesday morning. Rode back into the yard at a trot, that told Wyatt something was wrong, before the old man had even opened his mouth. North line, Otis said. Somebody's running cattle, through the gap by Miller's Creek. 40 head, maybe more. Whose brand? Can't rightly say. Nobody local, that's certain. Stranger's stock, driven in overnight most likely. Wyatt's jaw went tight. Grady's testing us, he said. Seeing how much ground he can take, before anybody bothers stopping him. So we stop him, Cora said. Flat. Simple. The kind of statement that didn't leave much room for a second opinion. That land's disputed, Wyatt said. If we push his cattle back across the line ourselves, he'll paint it as trespass on our part. Give some judge a reason to think we're the ones stirring trouble. And if we don't, Cora said, he keeps creeping that line forward an inch at a time, until there's no line left at all. That's not a strategy, Wyatt. That's just patience dressed up mean. Ping. Pong. Neither one backing down an inch, and something in the exchange made Otis glance over at the two of them, with an expression he was careful not to let either one see clearly. They rode the line together that afternoon. Pushed the strange cattle back across the boundary, slow and careful, no shots fired, no confrontation beyond the simple fact of two riders, and four hands doing a fence line's honest work. But somebody was watching, from the tree line the whole time. Wyatt caught the glint of it once, near sundown. A spyglass, maybe. Or just sunlight off a rifle barrel, hard to say, from that distance. Gone before he could be certain he'd seen it at all. He didn't tell Cora. Why not, he asked himself later, lying awake with the window open, and the night sounds of the ranch settling in around him. Why didn't you just say it plain? She's not some fragile thing that needs protecting from the truth. She rode into a mortgage trouble same as you did. She stared Grady down in your own yard, without so much as a tremor in her voice. Except you keep doing this. Keep catching yourself halfway through a sentence about her and stopping. Keep noticing things, the exact angle she sits a horse, the way she goes quiet a beat before she says something true, and then catching yourself noticing, and then feeling like a fool for noticing it all. Because she's 61 years old, and you're 29, and there is a version of this whole arrangement where none of that matters even a little bit, and there is another version where it's the only thing that matters, and you can't for the life of you work out which version you're actually living in. So you stop thinking about it. Until you can't. Which is most nights, lately. He didn't sleep much. Lay there listening to the wind, and somewhere past midnight, before he finally drifted under, he thought he heard, very faint, the sound of somebody moving around down in the kitchen. Cora. Couldn't sleep either, most nights that week. Too much turning over in her head. Too many things she wasn't ready yet to put a name to, sitting right under the surface of every ordinary thought she tried to have instead. The second letter from Holt found her 3 days after the gate. 14 days left. Forwarded again, same as before, in a hand she recognized, before she'd even broken the seal. She read it standing by the corral fence, morning light hard, and flat across the yard, and this one didn't ask her to consider anything. This one told her plain. Mother, I am coming west. I have arranged for 2 weeks away from my position, which was not easy to secure, and I intend to see this situation for myself. I have heard, from more than one source now, that you are staying on the property of an unmarried rancher nearly half your age, under circumstances that strike me, frankly, as reckless in the extreme. I do not say this to wound you. I say it, because someone has to, and it appears I am the only one left willing to. Cora read it twice. Then a third time. Nearly half your age. Reckless in the extreme. Someone has to say it, and I'm the only one willing to. She folded the letter. Slow. Deliberate. Her hands, she noticed with a distant, clinical sort of irritation, were not entirely steady. Because here is the thing nobody tells a mother about raising a careful, loving, entirely wrong-headed son. He learns to worry the exact same year he learns to walk. And somewhere along the way, she wasn't sure exactly when, wasn't sure she could point to the single afternoon it happened, that worry stopped being a boy's fear for his mother and started being a grown man's certainty that he understood her life better than she did. Which he doesn't. Which he has never once, not one single day of his entire adult life, actually bothered to ask her whether he does. She didn't answer the letter that morning either. Told herself there'd be time later, once every single fire currently burning around the edges of her life settled down enough, that she could sit and write her own son a letter that said what she actually meant instead of something calmer and smaller that wouldn't scare him further. She should have written back sooner. She'd understand that too, later. Understand it a great deal too late to matter the way she wanted it to. Jonah Pratt had been avoiding everybody's eyes for the better part of a week. Cora noticed it first, the way she noticed most things, quiet, patient, filing it away, without comment because a working ranch is no place to go digging into another man's private business uninvited. But by the fourth day of it, the avoiding had gotten bad enough, that even Otis, who noticed considerably less about people than he noticed about cattle, had started throwing the boy sideways looks across the supper table. "Something eating you, son," Otis said one evening. Not sharp. Just direct, the way the old man said most things. "No, sir. Too fast. Just tired is all." "Tired," Otis repeated. Flat. Unconvinced. "Yes, sir." Otis let it drop. But Cora, watching from across the table, saw the boy's hands, always moving, always restless, go still for exactly 1 second too long, before he picked his fork back up. She should have said something then. She'd think that too, later. Think it a great deal, in fact, in the days after the fire, turning the memory of that supper over and over, looking for the exact moment she could have reached across and pulled the boy's secret out of him, before it turned into something that nearly cost him his life. But hindsight is a luxury the present moment never once offers a person in advance. What Cora didn't know, what none of them knew, sitting at that supper table, with beans going cold, and a boy's hands gone briefly, tellingly still, was, that 4 nights earlier, Jonah Pratt had ridden into Coldwater Junction on an errand nobody had sent him on, and met a man waiting for him outside the feed store, who was not, strictly speaking, in the feed business at all. "Evening, Jonah." The voice alone had nearly stopped Jonah's heart. Because he knew that voice. Knew it the way a man knows the particular sound of a debt collector's boots on a porch. "Mr. Calder." "Didn't expect." "No," Grady said. "Pleasant. Easy. The kind of easy that made the hair stand up on the back of a person's neck. I don't imagine you did." He'd walked Jonah a little ways off, from the street. Away from lit windows. Away from anybody who might overhear. "That note your mother signed," Grady said. 2 winters back. When she took sick. Jonah's stomach had dropped straight through the ground. "I've been paying on it," he said. "Fast. Too fast. Every month I can manage." "You have," Grady agreed. "And the interest, unfortunately, climbs a good deal faster than a ranch hand's wages ever will. You understand the arithmetic of it, I trust." Jonah hadn't answered. Couldn't. His throat had gone tight and useless. "I could call the whole note tomorrow," Grady said. Still pleasant. Still easy. That was the worst part of it, Jonah would think later, how easy the man made it sound, like he was discussing whether instead of a family's entire future. "Your mother would lose the house. You understand that too, I imagine. Please." Or, Grady said, "You could do something small for me. Very small. Barely worth mentioning, really." And that was how it started. Not with a threat shouted. Not with a fist raised. Just a voice, pleasant and patient, laying out an arithmetic, so simple a frightened 20-year-old couldn't find a single seam in it to argue against. Just burn a little grass, Grady had said. Nobody'll get hurt by it. Looks like an accident. Puts enough fear into your Mr. Calder and that widow of his, that maybe they give up this whole arrangement, before the hearing ever happens. That's all. That's the whole of it. Jonah had said yes. Hadn't wanted to. God's honest truth, hadn't wanted any part of it. But a boy, with a sick mother, and a note he couldn't outrun doesn't always get to choose which version of himself walks away from a conversation like that one. He'd been carrying it ever since. Carrying it at supper, carrying it mucking out stalls, carrying it lying awake every night since, staring at the bunkhouse ceiling, and running the same 6 words, over and over in his head. Just a little grass. Nobody'll get hurt. He hadn't set the fire yet. Kept finding reasons to put it off. Kept telling himself tomorrow, and then tomorrow again, and every day he didn't do it felt like a small, private victory nobody else would ever know about. Until the day he ran out of tomorrows. The fire started on a windless afternoon. 10 days left. No lightning anywhere in the sky. No careless hand rolling a cigarette too close to dry tinder. Just a length of rag, soaked through with kerosene, and a boy's shaking hands, and a decision made weeks earlier by a man who'd never once had to look at the consequences of it up close. Because that's the thing about grass in high spring, after weeks of wind pulling every last drop of moisture up out of the ground. It doesn't creep. It runs. Cora smelled it first. Riding the west fence line alone, checking a gate hinge that had been sticking all week, the same gate, in fact, she'd latched shut, with her own 2 hands 10 days earlier, back when the worst thing on her mind had been an open gate meant, as a message. The wind shifted. And there it was. Smoke. Not the thin gray curl of a cook fire. The flat brown smear of something already too big to be stopped by a single bucket. Or 20. She didn't think, later, if anybody asked her to explain it properly. She didn't think. She turned the horse. And rode. Rode the kind of ride that leaves a horse's flanks heaving, and foam thick at the bit, because there wasn't time to spare the animal, and there wasn't time to spare herself either. Not with the wind doing what it was doing. Not with that fire already eating 100 yards of grass a minute, rolling hard toward the east pasture, where 30 head of cattle stood grazing, without the faintest idea what was closing in on them. She hit the yard shouting, before her horse had even fully stopped moving. Fire. West line. It's running. Otis came off the porch at a dead sprint. Wyatt came out of the barn, with a bridle still hanging forgotten, from one hand, and for 1/2 second, just the one, he looked at Cora's face, and understood the whole shape of the next hour, before she'd managed another word. Because that's what a real emergency does to a person's face, once they've lived through enough of them to recognize the look on somebody else's. It goes still. Jonah's out that way, Otis said. Voice flat, holding something back, through pure force of will. Sent him out an hour back to check the water trough on the east line. Wyatt didn't answer. Didn't need to. He was already moving. The ride out to the fire line took 11 minutes. 11 minutes that stretched and compressed at the very same time, the way real emergencies always seem to. Fast in a man's legs. Slow in his chest. Every single second both too short and unbearably long, all at once. Wyatt rode with his jaw locked tight, and his eyes fixed dead ahead on the brown smudge climbing higher, into the sky. Thicker now. Angrier. Feeding off a wind that seemed to have picked its own private fight with the whole afternoon. Cora rode a full length ahead of him the entire way. Didn't look back once. Because there wasn't time to look back. There was only time to ride, and think and count. How many acres? How much time left? How fast that wind was shoving flame toward 30 head of cattle, and one 20-year-old boy, who had no earthly idea a wall of fire was closing on him, from the west. And somewhere underneath the counting, because a mind does this, even in the worst moments, some stubborn animal part of it keeps thinking sideways even, while the rest is screaming forward, Cora thought of her own son. Thought, Holt would tell me I'm too old for this. Thought, Holt would be right, if being right meant anything at all right now. Because right now there was no room left for anybody's opinion about her age. There was only a fire, and a boy, and a stretch of grass she'd known better than her own name for 8 straight years. They crested the last rise together. And there it was. The whole west pasture, a solid wall of orange, and black smoke rolling low across the grass, moving faster than any man could hope to outrun on foot. Faster than most horses would want to try, either. The cattle had already scattered. Pure dumb terror scattering half of them the wrong way, straight along the fire's own path instead of away from it. Because cattle panic first, and think never, not even a little. And there, small against all, that smoke, a single figure on foot. Dragging a length of chain toward a stuck gate latch. Coughing hard. Stumbling. Boxed in on 3 sides now by flame, that had already jumped a ditch nobody on the ranch believed it could jump. Jonah! Cora shouted. Pointing. Already turning her horse toward the one gap in the fence line, that hadn't caught, yet, the single narrow corridor of unburned grass standing between the boy, and open pasture beyond. Wyatt saw it too. Saw the whole grim math of it in the same half-second Cora did. The fire was moving faster than Jonah could manage on foot. The gap was closing fast. And if that boy didn't get horsed, and moving in the next 30 seconds, there wasn't going to be any decision left for anybody to make. Cora. I see it. She was already gone. What happened next, Otis would tell it later at the supper table. Told it the way men tell the stories, that matter most to them. Plain. No embellishment needed, because the truth of it carried its own weight just fine on its own. Cora rode straight, into smoke thick enough to blind a grown man. Didn't slow. Didn't hesitate at the fence gap, even though flame had already caught the near post. Wood popping and hissing. Sparks riding the wind straight for her horse's mane. She got low over the saddle. Drove clean through it. Came out the other side, with her eyes streaming, throat scraped raw, and there was Jonah, 20 feet off, down on his knees now, coughing, chain still tangled around one boot, the fire close enough behind him, that Wyatt, arriving a half-length back, could feel the heat of it on his own face, from 30 yards out. 61 years old. Riding straight into a wall of fire like it was nothing at all. Cora didn't slow the horse down even a step. Swung low off the saddle. One hand locked hard around the horn. Body nearly parallel to the ground. The kind of move a person only pulls off clean, if they've done it 100 times before, in circumstances every bit as desperate. Every bit as unforgiving. Got a fistful of Jonah's collar. Hauled. The boy came up off the ground half choking, half screaming, and somehow, nobody could ever fully explain how, not even Cora herself, telling it later, got a leg up, and over behind the saddle, while the horse never once broke stride beneath either one of them. They cleared the gap, with maybe 4 seconds left to spare, before the last fence post gave out entirely, and the whole line went up behind them in a single roaring sheet. Wyatt was there, waiting, to pull Jonah down off the back of Cora's horse the second they broke clear, into open ground. The boy collapsed to his knees in the grass, coughing black smoke straight out of his lungs, hands shaking too hard to do anything, but grip fistfuls of dirt like the ground itself might still catch fire underneath him. "You're clear," Wyatt said. Kneeling beside him. Voice rough. "You're clear, Jonah. You're out." Jonah couldn't answer yet. Just kept coughing. Kept shaking. Cora sat her horse a moment longer. Chest heaving. Face streaked black with soot. Staring back at the wall of fire that, seconds earlier, had very nearly taken a 20-year-old boy's whole life along, with 30 head of cattle, and half a season's worth of grazing land. Then she swung down, and got straight to work. Because there wasn't time, yet to feel what had almost happened back there. That comes later. It always comes later, for people built the way Cora Whitfield was built. The fear shows up, after the danger's already passed, not before it. Not during it. Because during is exactly, when the work has to get done, and there's no room left, over in a person for anything else, while that's happening. They fought that fire for 6 straight hours. 6 hours of wet sacking beaten hard against flame. 6 hours of a bucket line running, from the stock pond. Otis and Dale, and 2 neighboring outfits who'd seen the smoke, from their own land, and ridden over, without waiting to be asked. Because that's simply what a person does out here, when a neighbor's grass starts burning. 6 hours of Wyatt and Cora working side by side, without a single wasted word passing between them. The particular kind of working silence, that only exists between 2 people, who have, somewhere across the last 2 weeks, without either one fully noticing it happen, started trusting each other, with their own lives. By full dark, the fire was out. 30 acres gone. Black and smoking, and bare under a sky finally, mercifully gone still. But the herd was safe, rounded up 2 miles east in a pasture the fire never once reached. The house stood safe. And Jonah was safe too, wrapped in a blanket by the bunkhouse stove, still coughing some, but alive. Whole. Sitting upright and breathing on his own. Alive because a woman he'd known barely 2 weeks had ridden straight into smoke to drag him back out of it. Wyatt found Cora down by the stock pond an hour after the last ember had been stamped fully dark. She sat on an overturned water trough, soot still smeared across one cheek, her hands, Wyatt noticed this, before anything else, before he even opened his mouth, shaking just slightly. Just enough that she'd folded them together in her lap, trying to hold them still, through pure willpower alone. He sat down beside her. Didn't say anything at first. "You saved his life," he said finally. "Wasn't thinking about that part." "I know." "Wasn't thinking much of anything," Cora said. Voice low. Rough from smoke. "Just saw the gap closing. Saw he wasn't moving fast enough. The rest just happened, I suppose. Happened around me more than through me." She looked down at her own hands. "Willed them still." "That's usually how the real ones go," Wyatt said. "The thinking about it part shows up later. If it shows up at all." Cora looked over at him. And there, right there, in the low light of a sky finally gone quiet, after 6 hours of fire, she said something. Small. Automatic. The kind of thing a person says, without thinking, because it's been said, so many times, before it's worn a groove, into their own mouth. She reached over, without quite meaning to, and brushed a streak of ash off the back of Wyatt's hand, where a spark had caught him near the wrist. "Hold still," she murmured. "It's only a little burn. Won't leave a mark, if you let it breathe instead of fussing at it." Wyatt went very, very still. Because he'd heard those exact words before. Not close to them. Not similar to them. Those exact words. That exact low, unhurried murmur, spoken by a voice he'd spent 3 years trying, and failing to place. A voice that had once, in the middle of the worst night of his entire life, said the very same thing, while wrapping a strip of cloth around a hand gone numb and frostbitten in a blizzard that had already claimed 2 men, from a neighboring outfit, that same week. "Hold still. It's only a little burn. Won't leave a mark, if you let it breathe instead of fussing at it." "Say that again," Wyatt said. Voice gone strange. Barely above a whisper. Cora blinked. "Say what?" "What you just said. About the burn." "I just said hold still." No, Wyatt said. The rest of it won't leave a mark, if you let it breathe. Say it exactly like that again. Cora looked at him a long moment. Confused now. Wary, the wariness of a person being asked to repeat something they said, without thinking, unsure why it mattered, so much all of a sudden. It's just something my mother used to say, she said slowly. I picked it up from her. Said it to my own children growing up. Guess I still say it without noticing. Winter, 3 years back. The Ogallala Trail, north of the Forks. A blizzard that came down, with almost no warning at all. Swallowed the sun whole inside 20 minutes. A rider thrown from his horse. Half frozen. Alone, out past where the rest of his outfit could ever hope to find him, before dark set in. A stranger, a woman, though he'd never once gotten a clear look at her face in that whiteout, never once gotten her name, finding him. Walking him into an old mine shack, before first light broke. Wrapping his half-dead hands in strips of cloth, murmuring the same low, steady words over and over while she worked, the way a person talks to a spooked animal to keep it from bolting. Hold still. It's only a little burn. Won't leave a mark, if you let it breathe instead of fussing at it. He'd carried those words for 3 years. Turned them over, so many nights he'd half convinced himself he must have dreamed the whole thing. Asked after that woman at every ranch, within 200 miles, and nobody ever once claimed her. Because she'd left, before he'd even woken up enough to thank her properly. Had cattle scattered clean across the next county. Couldn't stay to see it through. You saved somebody once, Wyatt said. Barely able to get the words out steady. 3 years back. Winter of. He stopped. Because Cora's face had changed. Gone very still. Very pale beneath the soot and the exhaustion. There was a rider, she said. Quiet now. Very quiet. Thrown from his horse. Half frozen, out past where anybody could find him before dark. I never got his name. Didn't have time to ask for it. Didn't much think I'd ever see him again to need it, either. She looked at him. Really looked at him this time. Adding years backward, onto his face, the way a person ages a photograph in their own mind, hunting for the boy underneath the man sitting across from her now. You gave him your coat, Wyatt whispered. Walked him into a mine shack, before first light. Left before he'd even woken up to thank you. Cora's breath caught hard in her chest. 3 years, Wyatt said. I asked after you at every ranch, within 200 miles. Nobody ever once claimed her. Silence stretched long between them. The last of the fire's smoke still hung faint in the night air. Somewhere out past the barn, an owl called once. Twice. Then went quiet. You saved my life, Wyatt said finally. And never once told me your name. And 3 years later, I met you again on a train platform. And the very first thing you told me was, that you weren't the woman I was waiting for. He almost laughed. It came out closer to something else entirely, something caught square between disbelief, and a grief gone old enough to have finally quieted down, and underneath both of those, something a good deal warmer. Something that had been waiting 3 long years for somewhere solid to land. Cora Whitfield, he said. I don't believe you've ever once in your whole life been the wrong anybody. Cora didn't answer right away. Used to wonder, if he made it, she thought. Wondered it for a long while. Figured I'd simply never know for certain. You knew the whole time, Wyatt said. Soft. Didn't know that I knew it, Cora said. Until just now. She looked up at him. Something in her face had softened in a way Wyatt hadn't seen from her before that moment. Not on the platform. Not through the fire. Not once across 2 weeks of watching her hold everything steady, and capable and entirely in control. Guess some things find their own way back around, she said. Whether a person goes looking for them or not. 3 days later, Otis found the rag. 7 days left. Half burned. Soaked clean through, even now, with the sharp ghost smell of kerosene. Snagged in the fence wire 100 yards upwind, from where the fire had first caught hold. Not lightning. Not carelessness. Set. Deliberate. Wyatt stood over that scrap of burned cloth a long time. Didn't say a word. Didn't need to. Everybody standing in that circle, Otis, Dale, Cora, understood exactly what they were looking at, without a single one of them saying it out loud first. Somebody on this ranch had lit that fire on purpose. Jonah, Otis said. Quiet. Not an accusation, exactly. Just a name spoken, with the weight of a man who'd known that boy 3 years, and hated more than almost anything being right about something he badly did not want to be right about. He was out that way, Dale said. Alone. An hour before it caught. Doesn't mean he did it, Wyatt said. Doesn't mean he didn't, Otis said. I'm saying what every one of us is already thinking. Somebody's got to say it plain. They found Jonah in the barn that evening. Sitting hunched on an overturned bucket in the dark. Hadn't lit a lantern. Hadn't touched a bite of supper. Just sitting there staring at nothing, hands still not fully steady 3 days after the fire. Wyatt stood in the doorway a long moment, before he said a single word. You said it, he said. Not a question. Jonah's whole body flinched like he'd been struck across the face. Didn't deny it. That was the thing that told Wyatt everything, before the boy had managed a single word, the silence stretching out, the way his shoulders came down, and folded in on themselves, collapsing under weight he'd clearly been carrying alone far too long already. I didn't want to, Jonah said. Voice cracking clean down the middle. God's honest truth, Mr. Calder. I didn't want any part of it. I owe money. Oh, a lot of money. To who? Silence. Jonah. Grady Calder, the boy said. Barely above a whisper now. Took a loan off him 2 winters back. When my mother took sick sudden, and I needed money fast, and nobody else around here would lend it, that quick without 100 questions attached. And the interest it kept climbing. Kept climbing till I owed more than I could ever hope to pay working ranch wages in 10 straight years. He looked up. Finally. Eyes red-rimmed and wrecked. He came to me 3 weeks back. Said if I didn't do something for him, he'd call the whole note due at once. Said I'd lose everything I had. Said my mother would lose everything, too. Wyatt felt something cold settle down deep into his chest. He wanted the fire, he said. Wanted it to scare us off. Wanted this outfit looking weak enough that a judge would believe it couldn't hold itself together long enough to be worth saving. Jonah nodded. Couldn't lift his eyes to meet Wyatt's. Said just burn a little grass, he said. Said nobody'd get hurt by it. Said it'd look like an accident. Instead you nearly died out there, Wyatt said. Nearly took Cora down with you. I know, Jonah's voice broke entirely now. I know it, Mr. Calder. Haven't thought about anything else these 3 days. Keep seeing that fence line closing in on me. And keep thinking, I did that. I set that fire myself. Could have died over money I owe a man, who never once cared whether I lived, or died so long, as his note got paid on time. The barn went quiet a long moment. Wyatt stood there, fists clenched at his sides. Every instinct in him screaming to throw this boy off the ranch, that very night. No wages owed. No second chances offered. Because trust broken is trust broken, and a man can't run a working outfit on hope alone, no matter how badly he might want to. Except. Except he thought about a line his own father had written 8 months before he died. Thought about the particular cramped, angry handwriting that had haunted him for the better part of a year. Too soft with the men. Too slow deciding anything that matters. And he thought about Cora, riding straight into smoke to pull a stranger's worst mistake clean out of the fire, before it could kill him for it. And he thought, this part came slower, came reluctant, came the way true things sometimes do, dragging their own feet the whole way, about a boy, with a sick mother, and no good options left. Cornered hard by a man, who specialized in cornering people, who couldn't fight back. "You're not fired," Wyatt said. Jonah's head came up fast. Disbelief written plain across his whole face. "Sir." "You're not fired," Wyatt said again. Firmer this time. "But you're going to work off every single hour of that debt to this ranch starting first thing tomorrow morning. And you're going to sit down with Otis and tell him everything. Every single thing Grady Calder has said to you these past weeks. Every threat. Every promise made. And you're going to say it plain enough that we can write it down and swear to it as true if it ever comes to that." "Why?" Jonah managed finally. Tears cutting clean tracks straight down, through the soot still smudged across his face. Wyatt thought about that a long moment. "Because somebody gave me a second chance 2 weeks ago," he said. "Stood on a train platform and could have turned around and walked away clean. Chose to stay instead. A man learns something from a thing like that if he's actually paying attention when it happens to him." He didn't glance toward the house when he said it. Didn't need to. Holt Whitfield arrived the following afternoon. 6 days left. Nobody at Red Wing was expecting him quite yet, but there he was, stepping down off the afternoon stage in Coldwater Junction in a suit far too fine for cattle country, dust already settling unwelcome on the shoulders of it, before he'd made it 30 feet from the depot. He'd ridden straight out to the ranch. Didn't stop to send word ahead. Didn't stop for anything. Cora was out by the corral when he came up the drive, and something in her chest went tight and complicated the second she recognized the set of his shoulders on horseback, because a mother knows her own son's silhouette from half a mile off, same as she knows a lame gate hinge or a spooked steer. Holt. Mother. He swung down off the horse. And Cora saw it immediately, the particular tightness around his eyes, the look of a man who'd spent the whole ride out rehearsing exactly what he intended to say, and hadn't managed to talk himself out of a single word of it. "You look," he started. Then stopped. Started again. "You look tired." "I look 61, Cora said. "Which is what I am. Same as I was the last time you saw me." "Mother, I heard about the fire." Cora went still. "Heard about it how?" "It doesn't matter how. I heard you rode into a burning field to pull a man out of it. 61 years old, and you saved his life," Cora said. Flat. "Yes. You could have died." "I didn't." "This time," Holt said. Voice rising now, the careful rehearsed calm cracking under the weight of whatever fear he'd been carrying the whole ride out. "This time you didn't. Mother, do you have any idea what it's like, sitting 3 states away, getting letters about mortgages, and holding companies, and now a fire, and every single time I think, this is the one, where somebody's going to write, and tell me you didn't make it out." Cora's jaw tightened. "I've been taking care of myself for 8 years, Holt." "Barely," Holt said. "Barely taking care of yourself, and now you've thrown yourself into the middle of somebody else's mess. Some rancher's inheritance scheme, from what I understand. A man half your age, using you to satisfy some outrageous condition in his father's will. That's not what's happening here." "Then what is happening here?" Holt said. "Because from where I'm standing, my 61-year-old mother is living on a strange man's property, riding into wildfires, getting threatening letters from land holding companies, and every single time I try to help, you tell me you're fine. You are not fine, Mother. You are in danger, and you are too proud, or too stubborn, or too. He stopped himself. Too late. Too old, Cora finished for him. Voice gone very quiet. That's the word you were reaching for, wasn't it? Too old to know my own mind. That is not what I said. It's what you meant. Wyatt had come out, onto the porch at some point during this, hadn't meant to intrude, had actually hesitated a long moment in the doorway, unsure whether this was a conversation that wanted a witness. But something in Cora's voice, something gone thin, and wounded underneath the flat steadiness she usually carried, pulled him the rest of the way out, onto the steps. Holt turned. Saw him. And something in his expression hardened, the way a man's face hardens, when he's finally found somewhere to aim all the fear he's been carrying, that has nowhere else useful to go. You're Calder, Holt said. Not a question. I am. My mother's letters mentioned you, Holt said. Didn't mention you were young enough to be her son. Holt, Cora started. No, Holt said. I came 2,000 miles for this, Mother, and I intend to say it plain, same as you're always telling me to. Mr. Calder, I don't know exactly what arrangement you've talked my mother into, but I know what it looks like, from the outside. A man about to lose his inheritance, unless he's married inside a month. A widow with land of her own, conveniently in trouble at the exact same time. That's not coincidence, that's opportunity, and I think you saw it the moment she stepped off that train. Wyatt's jaw tightened. But he kept his voice level. Your mother saved my life 3 years, before either one of us knew the other's name, he said. There's no scheme in that. No opportunity, either. Just two people, who happened to end up standing on the same platform at the worst possible moment, and decided, both of them, together, that they'd rather fight what's coming than run from it separate. Very pretty, Holt said. But I didn't ride 2,000 miles for pretty words. I rode out here, because my mother is 61 years old, and living alone on a ranch, that isn't even hers, tangled up in some other family's inheritance war, and getting threatened by land companies in the process. I want her safe. I want her somewhere she doesn't have to ride, into fires to prove a point to anybody. I don't need to prove a point, Cora said. Voice sharp now. I proved every point I ever needed to prove the day I buried your father, and kept this family's land standing, without a single soul's help. You weren't there for that, Holt. You were in Boston, reading law books, and I don't fault you for it, but don't you dare stand in this yard, and tell me what I need, or don't need to prove. Holt flinched. Genuinely flinched, the flinch of a grown man who'd just been struck somewhere old, and tender by his own mother's voice. I'm not trying to hurt you, he said. Quieter now. I'm trying to protect you. I know that, Cora said. And here, something in her voice softened, just slightly, just enough to show the love still sitting underneath all of it. I know you mean it kind, Holt. But protecting somebody, and deciding for them are two entirely different things, and you've been doing the second one, and calling it the first for 3 years running now. Silence sat heavy in the yard a long moment. There's a note on Larkspur, Holt said finally. A false one, most likely, given everything you've written me about this Grady Calder. I intend to look into it myself, while I'm here. Properly. With a lawyer's eye instead of a worried son's. That, Cora said, I would welcome. But I also intend, Holt said, to see this whole situation resolved. One way or another. Before I go back east. I won't leave you out here in the middle of a war, that isn't even yours, Mother. Not with a fire already set once. Not with a man threatening you both openly in your own yard, from what I understand. He looked at Wyatt. Long measuring. How many days, he said. Until your father's deadline. 6, Wyatt said quietly. 6 days now. Then you'll forgive me, Holt said, if I intend to watch every single one of them closely. He turned. Didn't wait for a reply. Walked back toward his horse, with his shoulders set rigid, the rigid of a man, who believed, with his whole aching heart, that he was doing the right thing. Cora stood watching him go. And for the first time, since she'd stepped down off that train 2 weeks earlier, carrying a rope instead of a hatbox, something in her face looked, just for a moment, genuinely uncertain. He doesn't mean it cruel, she said. Quiet. Half to Wyatt, half to herself. I know. He just doesn't see me, Cora said. Not anymore. Sees a mother, who needs looking after instead of a woman who's still standing exactly, as strong as she ever was. Wyatt didn't answer right away. Out past the north fence line, the burned acres still lay black and bare under the afternoon sun, waiting for spring rain that hadn't come yet. And somewhere in Coldwater Junction, a man named Grady Calder was almost certainly already hearing news of Holt Whitfield's arrival, already turning it over in his mind, already working out how a frightened, well-meaning son might become the single sharpest tool he'd been handed yet. 6 days. Whatever happens, Wyatt said finally, you're not alone in it. Not anymore. Whether your son believes that or not. Cora looked over at him. And something passed between them in that look, something that had been building slow and quiet since a train platform 2 weeks back, since a bog and a heifer and a length of rope, since a wall of fire and a phrase murmured, without thinking, that had cracked 3 years wide open in a single breath. No, she said finally. I don't suppose I am. But the clock kept running all the same. 6 days. And somewhere out there, past the burned grass, and a gate that had once been left open, as nothing more than a message, the real fight hadn't even started yet. 6 days became 4. 4 became 3. And somewhere in that shrinking arithmetic, Holt Whitfield stopped watching his mother like a man waiting to catch her falling, and started watching her like a man beginning, slowly, painfully, to understand something he hadn't let himself understand before. Because that's what proof does to a person. Even a stubborn one. Even a son who'd rehearsed his whole argument the entire ride out from Boston. It was the ledgers that did it. Not the fire. Not the fence line. The ledgers. Holt had ridden out to Larkspur the morning, after that first hard exchange in the yard, alone, telling himself it was simply due diligence, a lawyer's careful eye on his mother's affairs, nothing more sentimental than that. He'd pulled the old strongbox down from its shelf. Opened it himself, because Cora had handed him the key, without a word, without an argument, which had surprised him more than he wanted to admit. Inside, receipts. Yellowed. Dated. Signed twice over, once by Thomas Whitfield, once by the bank clerk who'd witnessed the final payment 8 years back. The note had been paid. Fully. Cleanly. 8 years ago, exactly as Cora had always believed. Which meant the letter, from Cheyenne, the one demanding 60 days, or forfeiture, wasn't a mistake. It was a lie. Built from nothing. Built on a signature somebody had forged, onto a document that had no business existing at all. Holt sat there a long time, with the receipt spread across the kitchen table, feeling something shift in his chest, that he didn't have a tidy legal word for yet. Because his mother hadn't been careless. Hadn't been foolish, hadn't let some old debt slip past her the way a person's mind is supposed to slip in old age, the way he'd half assumed, without ever once saying it plain, even to himself. She'd been right. The whole time. And somebody, with initials that matched a name he'd heard spoken, with real venom in Wyatt Calder's yard, had built an entire false debt out of nothing, but paper and patience, betting that a widow alone, 61 years old, wouldn't have the strongbox, wouldn't have the receipts, wouldn't have anybody willing to look close enough to catch the lie. They'd bet wrong. He didn't ride back, and say any of it plain, that first evening. Told himself he needed more. Needed the signature compared properly, needed something a judge would trust more than a son's word alone. So he rode into Coldwater Junction the next morning, and found the county land clerk's traveling deputy passing through, a careful, sharp-eyed man named Fenwick, who agreed, for a fee Holt paid gladly out of his own pocket, to compare the forged signature against half a dozen documents bearing Thomas Whitfield's true hand. 4 days left, by then. Fenwick took his time. Wouldn't be rushed, not even by a lawyer's urgency. Said a signature examined in haste was a signature examined poorly, and he'd rather ride out a day later, with something solid than a day sooner, with something a defense attorney could pick apart in an afternoon. Which left Holt 3 days. Pacing the porch at Red Wing in the evenings, watching his mother work fence, with a rancher half her age, and slowly, letting go of the version of this story he'd carried west, with him from Boston. 3 days left. That was when Grady's lawyer, a thin, careful man named Pruitt, filed to move the will hearing up. Wanted it settled fast, before anybody had time to dig too deep, into either debt, either forgery, either half of the trap Grady had spent months building. The judge, a sharp-eyed man named Corwin, with little patience for delay, agreed to hear both matters together. The will contest. The forged note. One courtroom, 2 mornings from now, both fires burning down to their conclusion at once. 2 days left on Wyatt's deadline, the morning the hearing was set to open. Fenwick rode in, that same evening, a day earlier than he'd promised, with the report finished, and a look on his face, that told Holt everything, before the man had said a single word. Mother. Cora looked up, from the porch, where she'd been mending a torn saddle blanket by lamplight, needle moving steady, through the canvas in a rhythm worn deep, into her hands, over 40 years. You found something. We found everything, Holt said. Voice unsteady in a way she hadn't heard from him since he was a boy. The note was paid, Mother. 8 years ago. Clean. There's no debt. There never was. And the signature on the false note doesn't match your husband's hand. Not close. A land office clerk confirmed it himself, in writing, this evening. Cora's hands went still on the needle. Then what? Forged, Holt said. Somebody built a new note out of nothing. And I'll tell you something else, it took a good deal longer to run down, Mother. The holding company behind it, the one that's been hounding you, was incorporated 11 months back. Filed by a lawyer working for a Mr. Grady Calder. Cora sat with that a long moment. The lamp flickered low between them, throwing shadows that moved slow across the porch boards. 2 days, she said finally. 2 days, Holt agreed. And I intend to be standing in that courtroom beside you, when the clock runs out on him instead of on you. He didn't say the rest of it, that night, the apology sitting behind his ribs, half-formed, still too raw, and too large for him to hand over properly. He'd say it. He knew he would, before this was through. Just not yet. Not until he'd finished doing something worth the words. The Coldwater Courthouse sat square at the center of town, brick front, tall windows, a flag hanging limp in a still morning sky. Wyatt and Cora rode in together at first light, Otis and Jonah trailing behind on a second wagon, every one of them dressed in the closest thing to formal clothes a working ranch could reasonably produce on short notice. Grady was already there. Standing on the courthouse steps beside Pruitt. And standing beside the two of them, Wyatt stopped walking outright. Because standing next to Grady, in a traveling dress, that looked entirely out of place against the dusty street underfoot, was a face he hadn't seen in 3 weeks. Hadn't expected to see again at all, if he was honest. Louisa Bennett. That's, Cora started. I know exactly who that is, Wyatt said quietly. Something cold settling into his voice. Grady smiled when he caught them looking his way. Thin. Satisfied. The smile of a man laying down a card he'd been holding a good long while, waiting patient for precisely this moment to finally play it. Cousin, he called out. Brought along a witness you might just remember. The courtroom filled fast that morning. Half of Coldwater had turned out for it, word having traveled the way it always does in a town that size. A good story never stays quiet long, and this particular one had every ingredient a good story ever needs. A missing bride. A widow off her own land. A ticking deadline. A cousin sitting on railroad money, waiting patient in the wings for it all to fall apart. Judge Corwin took his seat up front. Gray-bearded, spectacles riding low on his nose, the kind of face that had heard every excuse a courtroom could ever produce, and had long since stopped being impressed by a single one of them. State your petition, he said to Pruitt. Pruitt stood. Smoothed his coat flat. Your Honor, my client contends the marriage set to take place in 2 days was arranged entirely in bad faith. Solely to satisfy the terms of a will, and defeat a legitimate inheritance claim. We have a witness prepared to speak directly to the circumstances under which Mr. Calder sought out a wife in the first place. Call your witness. Louisa Bennet walked to the stand, with her eyes fixed somewhere well above every face in the room. The posture of a woman who'd rehearsed this whole thing, and didn't quite trust herself to look directly at anyone, while she said it. Miss Bennet, Pruitt began. You corresponded with Mr. Calder for how long, prior to your arranged wedding day? 6 months. And on the day you were meant to marry him, what happened? Louisa's composure flickered. Just slightly. I never got off the train, she said. Sent a letter instead. Through another woman. The very same woman, Pruitt said, gesturing toward Cora, who is now, 3 weeks later, prepared to marry Mr. Calder herself. Does that strike you as an unusual coincidence, Miss Bennet? Objection. Wyatt's lawyer half rose. Calls for pure speculation. I'll allow the question, Corwin said. Answer if you're able to, Miss Bennet. Louisa hesitated. And then, this was the part that shifted the whole room at once, the part nobody had planned for, least of all Grady, standing rigid near the back of the courtroom, her composure cracked straight through. I need to say something, she said. Voice unsteady now. Something I wasn't planning on saying today. Something Mr. Calder, she gestured toward Grady, without once looking his direction, paid me money to keep quiet about entirely. The whole courtroom went dead silent. Grady half rose out of his seat. Your Honor, this witness is not. Sit down, Mr. Calder, Corwin said. Flat. Final. Miss Bennet. Continue. Louisa's hands gripped hard at the rail of the witness stand. He found me 3 weeks ago, she said. Out in Omaha, on my way back east toward home. Said he'd pay my train fare, and considerably more besides, if I came back out to Coldwater, and testified that Wyatt Calder had been, that he'd been desperate about the whole arrangement. Cruel about it, even. Said things that would make the marriage look forced. Coerced, in a manner of speaking. That's a plain lie, Grady said. Standing fully now. Your Honor, this is. I've got the letter, Louisa said. Loud now. Cutting clean through whatever Grady meant to say next. The one he wrote me offering the money outright. I kept hold of it. Don't rightly know why I kept it, except some part of me must have known I'd need it eventually. To prove I was telling the truth about something, at least once. She pulled a folded paper from inside her coat sleeve. Held it out, with a hand that was shaking badly now, but held it out steady all the same. I'm not a brave woman, she said. Voice cracking clean through. Already proved that once, running from a wedding instead of facing a decent man honest to his face about it. But I'm not going to sit up here and lie under oath for money on top of everything else I've already done wrong this spring. Not about a good man. Whatever else I might be, I'm not that particular kind of person. The bailiff carried the letter forward. Corwin read it, through in total silence, the whole courtroom holding its breath around him the entire time. And when he finally looked back up, his expression had gone hard, as flint struck twice. "Mr. Calder," he said, addressing Grady directly, "you may want to consult your counsel, before this proceeding continues one moment further." Grady said nothing at all. His face had gone the exact color of old ash. It should have ended right there. By every reasonable measure of courtroom drama, it should have. The villain thoroughly exposed. The petition collapsing under its own dead weight. Except Holt rose, from his seat near the front, and the whole room turned to look at him instead. "Your Honor, if the court will permit it," he said. "I have additional evidence bearing directly on this matter." Corwin studied him a long moment. "State your name, and your interest in this proceeding." "Holt Whitfield. My mother is Cora Whitfield, whose land borders the Red Wing to the north. I am an attorney, and I've spent the last several days investigating a note filed against my mother's property by a holding company called G.C. Holdings." He walked forward. Set the deputy clerk's written findings on the table, before the bench. "That note claims my mother's late husband left a debt unsettled. It's false. The debt was paid in full 8 years ago, the receipts are on record, and I have copies here. The signature on the false note doesn't match Thomas Whitfield's true hand, confirmed in writing by a county land office deputy, who examined it against 6 other documents yesterday evening." He paused. "Let it land. And the holding company that filed it, Your Honor, was incorporated 11 months ago. By a lawyer working for Mr. Grady Calder." The courtroom erupted into low, urgent murmuring. Corwin brought his gavel down once, sharp, and the room settled. "Mr. Calder," Corwin said. Voice gone very cold now. "Would you care to explain to this court how a note you had no legal connection to came to be forged, filed, and pursued against a widow's property, under the name of a holding company you personally incorporated?" Grady stood very still. Pruitt had gone pale, already shuffling papers, with the frantic energy of a man calculating exactly how fast he could distance himself from a client about to face charges considerably worse than a contested will. "I have nothing further to say," Grady said. Finally. Voice tight. "I imagine not," Corwin said. Bailiff. "See that Mr. Calder does not leave this courthouse, until the district attorney's office has had a chance to speak with him regarding forgery and attempted fraud. As for the will contest." He looked at Wyatt. Then at Cora. "Long measuring. I've heard enough this morning to understand a great deal more than I expected to, when this session opened," Corwin said. "But there's one matter I haven't heard addressed yet, and I'd like it addressed plainly, separate from any ranch, any deadline, any cousin's ambition sitting in this room today." He removed his spectacles. Cleaned them slow on his sleeve. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. "Please rise." Cora rose. Stood straight. The same way she'd stood in Wyatt's own yard, facing down 2 armed men weeks earlier. "I've got one question for you," Corwin said. "And I'd ask you to answer it honestly, because I've sat on this bench 30 years, and I can generally tell the difference." "Ask it, then. Do you love this man?" The question hung there in the air a long moment. Cora looked over at Wyatt. Really looked at him, past the deadline, past the ranch, past everything that had brought the two of them to this particular room on this particular morning. "I pulled him half frozen out of a snowstorm 3 years ago," she said. "Didn't know his name. Didn't think I'd ever see him again. And some part of me carried that forward anyway, without even understanding I was carrying it at all." She paused. Her voice, when it continued, had gone quieter. Steadier. "I'm 61 years old, Your Honor. Old enough that most folks in this county, including, until very recently, my own son, believe a woman my age has finished doing whatever brave, or foolish thing she was ever going to do, with her life. That the only thing left is to sit quiet somewhere safe, and let younger people worry over her. She looked out at the courtroom. At Holt, watching his mother now, with an expression that had nothing left of the anger he'd carried in from Boston. "They're wrong," Cora said. "I rode into a fire 3 weeks ago, because it needed doing, and I'll ride into the next one too, if it comes to that. Age doesn't retire a person from courage, Your Honor. It just makes the courage a little more hard-won, is all." She turned back to face the judge. "This ranch is simply where I finally caught up to what I'd already been feeling the whole time, 3 years before I ever knew this man's name. So yes, I love him. And I'd stand up in front of this whole courtroom, or any other one, and say it plain." Wyatt's chest tightened in a way that had nothing whatsoever to do with fear. Corwin nodded slow. Set his spectacles back onto his nose. "Petition dismissed," he said. "And Mr. Grady Calder, I'd strongly advise you retain new counsel, before considering any further action whatsoever in this county. The matter of the forged note will be referred to the district attorney directly." The gavel came down hard. Grady didn't stay around to hear the rest of it. He was gone, from the courthouse, before the room had even fully emptied out. Pruitt trailing behind him, with the hurried step of a lawyer already halfway to another town in his own mind. Word would reach Coldwater, within the week, that Grady Calder had left the whole territory entirely. Sold what little he had left to a cattle syndicate for a fraction of what the railroad would once have paid, and never once came back to lay claim to any part of the Red Wing again. But that was later. A footnote to everything else. Right then, standing on the courthouse steps in thin spring sunlight, none of that mattered yet. Not one bit. Holt found his mother first. Pushed through the thinning crowd, and stood there a moment in front of her, hat in his hands, looking, for the first time, since he'd stepped down off that stage days earlier, entirely unsure of himself. "I was wrong," he said. Simple. No lawyer's careful phrasing left in it at all. "Not just about the note, Mother. About all of it. I spent 3 years writing you letters telling you what you couldn't do anymore. And this whole week, watching you work a burned fence line, watching you stand up in that courtroom just now, and say all of that, plain, in front of a room full of strangers, I understood something I should have understood a long time, before I ever climbed onto that stage." "What's that?" Cora said. "Quiet. That I never once actually asked you," Holt said. "Whether you needed protecting. I just decided it. The same way I decided you'd gone careless, with a debt that turned out to be somebody else's lie entirely. I'm sorry, Mother. Truly. I came out here to save you, and instead you very nearly had to save yourself, from me, too." Cora looked at her son a long moment. Something in her chest, wound tight for weeks now, finally loosened all the way through. "I don't need you to stop worrying about me," she said. "That's not what a son does, and I wouldn't want a son who didn't. I just need you to trust that I get to decide, myself, what I'm still capable of. That's all I've ever wanted from you, Holt. Not less love. Just more trust folded in beside it." Holt nodded. Slow. And then, for the first time in longer than either of them could easily remember, he pulled his mother into an embrace right there on the courthouse steps, in front of half the town. "I'd like to stay," he said, muffled against her shoulder. "For the wedding. If that's still happening." Cora laughed. Actually laughed, bright and unguarded, the sound of it carrying clean across the thinning crowd. "It's happening," she said. "Try and stop it." Wyatt found Cora at the edge of the crowd a few minutes later. Holt stood a few respectful steps back now, watching his mother, with the quiet pride of a man who'd finally caught up to what he should have understood weeks ago. "You didn't have to say all that back there," Wyatt said quietly. "Just for her." "Wasn't planning on it," Cora admitted. Just came out on its own once I got started. I've been trying to say something for a week now, Wyatt said. Kept losing my nerve every single time I got close to it. What is it? Wyatt reached into his coat. Pulled out a folded page, an entry copied out, from his father's old journal, the one he'd found in a trunk in the equipment shed, the one he'd read a dozen times, over since that first bitter note had nearly convinced him his father thought him unworthy of the whole inheritance. My father wrote this 8 months, before he died, he said. Wanted me to understand it eventually, in his own stubborn way. Took me most of a lifetime, and one very stubborn widow to finally get all the way there. He handed it over. Cora read it through slow. Read the part about choosing, about a real chance to find out who a person actually was, given enough time, and a reason bigger than himself to earn it by. Read the part about hoping his son might find somebody who chose him. Not the land, not the family name, just him, plain and simple. When she looked back up, her eyes had gone wet. He wanted you to have a real choice, she said. He did, Wyatt said. And I'm making it right now. Standing here on these courthouse steps, whole town still watching us. Not on account of any deadline. Not on account of any will. Because somewhere between a train platform, and a fire line, and a torn saddle blanket, I stopped thinking of you, as help I'd hired on for 29 days, and started thinking of you instead, as the one person I want standing beside me for however many days I've got left in this life. Cora didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she smiled. The kind of smile that comes on slow, and lands hard once it finally arrives. Guess it's a good thing I already said yes to a ranch, she said. Turns out I was saying yes to the rancher the whole entire time. Just took me a good while to admit it plain, even to myself. They married 2 mornings later, on Wyatt's 30th birthday. Exactly as the will had once demanded of him. The very last day the clock allowed. And by then neither one of them was thinking about the deadline at all, only about the morning ahead of them, and the years standing open behind it. No courthouse this time around. No borrowed church either. Just the yard at Red Wing, swept clean, the whole outfit standing witness. Otis in his one good hat. Dale grinning like a fool, through the entire ceremony. Jonah Pratt standing straight-backed and clear-eyed, weeks now sober, from the weight he'd been carrying alone, and finally, visibly, a young man instead of a boy still hiding, from his own worst mistake. Holt walked his mother across the yard himself. Hadn't planned on staying this long in the territory, when he'd first set out from Boston. But a hard week riding west for a courtroom hearing had somehow turned into something else entirely, watching his mother build a whole life he hadn't expected, and couldn't have been prouder of, if he'd planned every single piece of it himself. Cora wore her own canvas riding skirt for the ceremony. Mended at one knee, the stitching plain and practical, because a woman doesn't stop being, who saved her groom from a snowstorm just because the wedding finally caught up to the rescue years late. The circuit preacher, who married them, asked no questions he didn't already know good, honest answers to. And when it came time for the vows themselves, Wyatt didn't recite a single word borrowed out of any book. Word around town is I bought myself the wrong bride, he said. Loud enough for the whole yard to hear it clean. And half of them laughed at that. And Cora laughed loudest of the whole bunch. Best mistake I ever made in my entire life, Wyatt said. Because it led me straight to the right one instead. 3 years late getting here. And worth every single day of the wait. Cora took his hand in both of hers. You didn't buy a single thing, she said. I chose all of this. Same as I chose to stay past 2 days. Same as I chose to ride straight into that fire. Same as I chose you. Every single time it mattered. Nobody bought me anything, Wyatt Calder. I walked in here on my own 2 feet, and I intend on staying here, that same way. Wouldn't have it any other way, Wyatt said. Some nights, sitting together on the porch, with the whole ranch gone quiet around them, Wyatt still finds himself thinking back on that morning on the platform. The flowers wilting slow in his fist. The woman stepping down off the second car, who wasn't the one he'd thought he was there to meet. He thinks about how close he came to missing the whole thing entirely. How easy it would have been to turn away angry that morning. To write the whole spring off, as nothing more than bad luck stacked on worse paperwork. Instead he got the truest thing he ever earned in his life. Not because any will demanded it of him. Because a woman rode a long hard way to deliver a stranger's bad news kindly. And a man had the good sense, standing right there on that platform, to shake her hand instead of cursing his own rotten luck. And everything that mattered afterward grew straight up out of that one small, ordinary choice. The exact same way the biggest things in a life so often do. Quiet. Unplanned. And, in the end, exactly right.